These aged spires and ruins stand today in a surreal twilight. Dark clouds are again gathering across the continent. Ancient cities, which know well the bloody tread of empire's decline, quiver under a fast-moving wind. As the storm grows ever closer, it feels as if they may tumble. Will Europe fortify herself before it hits?
Jean-Claude, please.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, when I was invited by the President to the White House, I had one intention. I had the intention to make a deal today, and we made a deal today. We've decided to strengthen our cooperation on energy. The EU will build more terminals to import liquefied natural gas from the US. This is also a message for others. As far as agriculture is concerned, the European Union can import more soybeans from the US, and it will be done. This, of course, is on the understanding that as long as we are negotiating, unless one party would stop the negotiations, we will hold off further tariffs, and we reassess existing tariffs on steel and aluminium.
Prior to his meeting to discuss tariffs with Trump on the 25th of July, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, promised that he would stand firm against the President's demands. The results indicate that he did anything but. The EU had committed to purchase US gas and soybeans. In return, it had received nothing but Trump's word that the US would not impose further tariffs, and that those already implemented could be discussed further. For all intents and purposes, Juncker had sounded the horn of retreat. This indicates a simple reality. The EU is not yet able to engage in an open trade war with the US. The US is its largest trading partner and, more importantly, its most profitable. In 2017, the EU had an overall trade surplus of €19,729 billion, with an enormous amount of this surplus derived from trade with the US. If it were to lose even 17% of this surplus it gains from US trade, it would fall into a trade deficit. To recoup such a loss, the EU would need to increase the surplus it derives from its next most profitable trading partner by almost 50%. As such, the EU has little choice but to demur to the US's demands on trade, as it stands to lose more by opposing them. Therefore, Juncker's retreat was a prudent and tactical step. It does not indicate that the EU imperialist bloc lacks the will to confront the US. Quite the opposite is true, and nowhere does this emerge more clearly than in the case of Iran. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran Deal, was signed in 2015 by the permanent members of the UN Security Council, that is Britain, China, France, Russia and the US, alongside Germany and the EU. It was intended to curb Iran's nuclear program, offering greater financial investment and a reprieve from sanctions in return for incredibly stringent regulation of any Iranian nuclear development. Since the deal was signed, EU trade with Iran has more than doubled, reaching €21 billion in 2017. Following Trump's withdrawal from the deal and the reinstatement of sanctions on those trading with Iran, the EU has acted swiftly and resolutely in attempting to defend this trade. On the 18th of May, the European Commission proposed the EU governments make transfers to the Iranian Central Bank in euros for oil purchases, thus avoiding any consequence of the US's sanctions. Despite concerns from the French President Macron, the plan was passed by the Commission. On the same day, the EU also approved measures that forbid member states from complying with the extraterritorial effect of the US's sanctions and protect them from any consequence within the EU. This, however, was nowhere near enough. The first significant blow to the EU's attempts to maintain its business in Iran came on the 7th of August, when the German carmaker Daimler AG announced that it would be suspending what it described as very limited activities in Iran. An even greater blow followed on the 20th of August, with the French oil giant Total announcing that it too was withdrawing. Total is the fourth largest energy company in the world, with assets at around $242.63 billion. The significance of this is twofold. Firstly, it highlighted the enormous problems facing European monopolies in investing in Iran. Although the European Commission's plans to transfer funds to Iran via EU governments could potentially protect individual transfers from US sanctions, these companies have enormous trade in dollars. To continue to trade with Iran, therefore, is to risk all of their trade in dollars. Secondly, the withdrawal of Total demonstrated that the US strategy was succeeding in beating out Europe's largest players. Sure enough, Total was followed by more EU monopolies, with British Airways, Air France, Alonzi and Maersk all announcing their intent to withdraw from Iran on the 24th of August. This withdrawal led the EU to consider alternative methods which would allow European businesses to continue to trade with Iran. In early September, the bloc concluded that it would need to focus upon smaller businesses with less trade in dollars. To do so, it would need either small banks or its state central banks to manage money transfers to Iran, with central banks preferred as a US sanction would not destroy them overnight. After concerns were raised by the European Central Bank, this strategy was thrown out. This led to Germany, France and Britain announcing that they would set up a special purpose vehicle to manage oil trade with Iran on the 14th of September. The initial idea was that this could operate as an accounting firm within the EU to manage trade between nations and Iran. However, this would still risk US sanctions on those using its currency. As such, the conception of the special purpose vehicle was changed. On the 26th of September, the EU announced that the vehicle would be operating under a kind of bartering system. No cash would change hands, and instead, European, Chinese and Russian companies would exchange goods for oil. Even this was not sufficient, with Italy's Eni and Spain's CEPSA oil companies announcing their intent to follow Total and withdraw from Iran on the 4th of October. The tortuous difficulties that the EU has faced in attempting to maintain its trade with Iran highlight the realities of attempting to confront the US, even via a proxy. Though the dollar is not able to maintain itself as the world's currency anchor for much longer, its power is still incredibly vast. To date, the dollar accounts for 44% of the world's daily turnover in foreign exchange, in comparison to 13% of daily turnover for the euro and 2% for the renminbi. On top of this, the US is still the world's leading supplier of both bonds and equities. In 2016, it accounted for 43% of the $19 trillion worth outstanding globally in bonds. In the same period, the US accounted for 39% of the $70 trillion worth of global equity stock outstanding. To face a sanction from the dollar is therefore to lose access to nearly half of the world marketplace. Whilst the political will to challenge the US in Iran clearly exists within the EU, it cannot command its businesses to obey such a will. For these businesses, the prospect of losing access to that much trade for the sake of a single market is simply not worth it. The EU is definitively on the back foot. However, the EU's experience in Iran has not weakened its resolve, but strengthened it. Understanding that the root of the EU's inability to manage its own interests stems from the dollar, Juncker used his State of the Union speech before the European Parliament on the 12th of September to argue that the time had come to make the euro the world's currency anchor. The first step toward doing this is to increase the amount of trade that the EU does in euros and to decrease the amount it does in dollars. Juncker provided one way of doing this in his speech, arguing that the EU should cease the aid payments it provides to nations in the African continent and convert this to trade. This would represent an enormous deepening of Europe's exploitation of Africa, while strengthening the euro and opening new avenues for capital accumulation. However, it also runs the risk of opening another front in the EU and the US's confrontation, as the US is making plans to consolidate its presence on the continent to head off Chinese investment. A second measure under consideration is equally risky. The suggestion is that Europe could bolster the flow of the euro by paying for its energy imports in the currency. With Russia as the EU's largest provider of gas and oil, this would integrate Europe's relationship with the nation as a fundamental pillar in its plan to challenge the dominance of the dollar and US imperialism. Though Russia is more than willing, planning to reduce its own dependency on the dollar, the political problems of making such a move are obvious. In strengthening its relationship with Russia, the EU would risk further splits, further antagonism from the US, and perhaps even a drastic escalation in the conflict between Russia and NATO. Whilst the EU's actions in Iran and the ambitions of the European Commission to achieve a euro domination of the world economy demonstrate that a faction of the European imperialist bourgeoisie feels its time has come, this attitude is not shared across the continent. Its counterpart? Fascism.
Every day it is going to be a fight.
The imperialist crisis has summoned up the ghouls of Europe's past. Encouraged and doted upon by the US, the resurgence of fascism as a serious political force in particularly Italy, Hungary and Poland presents a severe obstacle to the EU imperialist bloc. Among the manifold flags, cries and salutes of this resurgence, there is one striking political commonality. Fascism has come to destroy the EU. For that faction of Europe's imperialists dreaming of a dominant euro, this must be dealt with swiftly and brutally. Viktor Orban's Hungary provides a striking example of how. To understand the EU's actions against Orban's Hungary, we first need to understand something of its context. Though the European Union is an imperialist alliance, this does not mean that every nation within it is imperialist. To the contrary, Hungary, the Baltic states, and sections of Southeast Europe serve as incredibly lucrative investments for Europe's imperialists. This produced substantial tensions following the 2008 banking crash, with the EU imposing austerity upon many of its smaller states, including Hungary. Further tensions can be seen in the EU's handling of migration. In 2015, Hungary took the sixth largest number of migrants across the EU, whilst Germany, Sweden and France took in more migrants than Hungary. Distribution wasn't proportional, placing greater financial and infrastructure pressure on poorer states. In consequence, Hungary rejected the EU's migrant quota. This has continued to escalate, with Hungary and Poland rejecting new quotas at the beginning of 2018. Orban's fascism has been allowed to flourish in this context. In the last 3 years, he has created an armed force of border hunters, limited Hungary's refugee intake to 5 asylum seekers a week, and introduced indefinite detention. The continued rejection of the EU's laws has led to the formation of clear fractures and disruption within the imperialist bloc. Europe's imperialists find this untenable. Acting purely out of a desire to prevent the EU from fracturing further, an EU vote on the 12th of September saw the bloc apply what has been termed the nuclear option to Hungary. That is, Article 7 of the Treaty of Lisbon. This provision allows the EU to retain Hungary as an EU member state and to continue to derive profit from it, while stripping it of voting rights in the European Council. In other words, Europe's approach toward the problem of anti-EU fascism is simply to deprive it of any ability to influence the bloc's policy. Whether this will be successful or simply galvanise the forces of fascism remains to be seen. Ultimately, the question facing Europe is one of two extremes. The imperialists at the head of the EU bloc are attempting to bolster its power and achieve dominance over the world market. At the same time, the resurgence of fascism in Europe threatens to split the bloc, leading to its collapse. Whether the EU will rise or fall is an open question, but neither result benefits the mass of humanity, even remotely. Within this twilight, only one thing is certain. Night is coming.